Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching this. I'm Jamie Molt, and this is the Grad Connection, where my goal is to try to help graduate students do more than just survive in graduate school. I want to see you thrive. And so, I would encourage you, if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, if you've stumbled across this video, I'd subscribe to the YouTube channel. You may want to connect in the Grad Connection Facebook group, which is a private Facebook group. It's predominantly for Purdue students, but really, if you're a grad student anywhere, you could join in. Um, and you could also connect with me on Facebook or LinkedIn. So, as I started thinking about this week's topic, I was actually thinking, because really, first of all, you'll see that I'm recording this from my office here at Purdue. So it's nice to be getting back to a normal work environment. So I'll probably be recording them in both places as need be over the coming semester. And as we're ramping into kind of entering or approaching the fall semester, kind of where my mind always goes is to kind of think about what's coming up in the fall semester, coming up in the semester coming forward. And so, I kind of assume that graduate students, whether you're a returning graduate student or maybe a new graduate student, you're probably doing the same. And so, given that, what I think I'm going to do over the next, and I don't know how many weeks, it really depends on when I suppose I run out of topics along this thread, or if I get tired of it. Or if people are not watching it, I may switch gears. But at least for right now, I want to do a series on, I'll just call it the teaching assistant series. And so, my background at Purdue, I started as an undergraduate student in 1989. Then moved straight from a bachelor's into a master's degree. Was a teaching assistant, and so I kind of came up through the teaching assistant ranks. And so I kind of, and then really when I became faculty, teaching was the primary focus for me in the college that I was in at the time. The primary focus was teaching, and that's kind of what kept me at Purdue, was just kind of this desire for undergraduate teaching, and then that shifted obviously into graduate teaching and graduate research and all those kinds of things. And so, some topics that I kind of jotted down just so you kind of know maybe what's coming. Today, what I want to talk about are kind of like what is an assistantship? What are the different types of assistantships, and those kinds of some things I think are important to know. Um, but I also want to talk about teaching assistant roles. So that's where it really focuses on teaching assistant. So because essentially what happens is teaching assistants are used in lots of different ways. So I want to talk about that. Um, how do you become successful as a teacher? I like to think that I do a pretty good job at teaching. I'm always learning and always open to learning to become a better teacher, but I try to share some things there. I'm not really sure what that'll entail yet. I also want to talk about curriculum design and course design, because sometimes graduate students will find themselves in a position of designing courses. And even if you don't, I think the material will be good. We're going to talk about syllabi, how you develop them, what are the important things to have in it, objectives, what are those, what are active learning techniques, cognitive strategies, rubrics, all those kinds of things. And then I also want to spend some time talking about lecturing. That is, developing presentation skill, and trying to be engaging in the classroom, and some of the things that I've learned in 25 years of being in the classroom at a university. And then lastly, also some tangential issues like grading issues. What do you do when things come up? How do you deal with office hours? So, and I'm sure that as I go through this, these topics will probably shift. I'm not necessarily going to do them in that order. I'm really kind of, as I've been doing these the last 20 weeks, and this will be 21, I suppose. I'm just going to kind of take it, and whatever's on my heart and mind at the time, that's really what I do. But key is I want to do kind of this teaching assistant series. So hopefully you find it useful. If you have colleagues, and now I will admit that as I present all of this material, it comes from a Purdue perspective. I have not been at another university, but I do think there's some consistency across universities, and so I think some of these things will transfer. Some things will actually apply across the board, regardless of what university you go to. So this one, this video, I just really want to focus on assistantships versus fellowships. What are they? What are things to know? So let's just kind of start there. Of what is an assistantship versus what is a fellowship? And in most cases, assistantships are funded centrally through a university. At Purdue, we basically have what I would call three flavors of assistantships. We have a teaching assistantship, we have a resident assistantship, and we have a graduate assistantship. And I'll talk about what those are here in a minute, but those are kind of the three flavors. But an assistantship is like, basically it's an employment. You have a job, you have tasks that have to be done, deliverables that have to be created, so on and so forth. There's, you're basically doing something for the institution, versus a fellowship, which is usually directed monies, and it may or may not be things that are directly related to the university. At least at Purdue, a lot of the fellowships are actually to support your own research. So rather than having to do teaching on the one hand and doing your research and your academics, essentially you can, with a fellowship, oftentimes you can purely focus on the research you're doing or whatever the particular fellowship is. So that's one big difference between assistantship and fellowship. And I will say, when you're in an assistantship role, particularly in the teaching assistant role, because I really can't speak to the resident assistant. So let me say what those are. So teaching assistant is you have teaching responsibilities in the classroom. Various universities may have different loadings. They may have different requirements of what you can and cannot do. I will say at Purdue, you could have one teaching assistant could simply be responsible for grading, and another another teaching assistant could be responsible for the entirety of, let's say, a lab section of a course, or a recitation section of a course. And when I say recitation, I'm talking about basically it's kind of like an addendum to a primary lecture that a faculty might give. A laboratory would be where you come and do something specific, whether that be bench work like beakers and labs and stuff in chemistry, or whether that be computer work in a computer lab or whatever. So some graduate students are responsible for labs. And then there are also situations where a graduate student might be responsible for the entirety of a course, under the direction of a faculty typically, but you pretty much have free reign. And those different kinds of assistantships exist at Purdue. I can only assume the same variety exists at other research-intensive institutions. But a key thing, if you're coming to Purdue or somewhere else, one of the things you want to know is kind of what are the range of things that a teaching assistant does. Are there limits to what they do? Is there variation across campus? Is it implemented differently? And like at Purdue, it certainly is. So we talk about teaching assistants. Again, the reason that I want to spend time talking about this is because of the variety of things that you can do. And you really kind of have to master a wide variety of skills. And a lot of times people that are thrown into teaching assistantships, a lot of times I know, as a graduate teaching assistant, when I was working on my master's degree, I really didn't have any training. The only thing, it was basically on the job training, just mentoring and modeling. And now fortunately I had some really good role models to follow in faculty. And I kind of tried to pick up or glean the important things from them, and try to be mentored by them and be open to what they would say or do. And when I saw something in a particular faculty that I wanted to actually be modeled in my own teaching, I really kind of focused on that and tried to hone that. Now, I will also admit that I did start teaching as an undergraduate student. So when I was a junior, I was teaching in a lab section. Some universities allow undergraduate students to teach, others do not. A lot of times they significantly limit what an undergraduate student can do as far as teaching. Usually it's limited maybe only to grading. It might be limited to a lab section. Like in my case, it was a computer lab section that I was responsible for. But most of what I learned on the job. And it wasn't until now, part of my master's degree was focused in curriculum and instruction and instructional design and those kinds of things. But a lot of people that are working on graduate degrees, whether they be master's degrees or PhDs, a lot of times they're not taking classes relative to teaching. It's a side gig that they're doing to try to support their schooling. So to me, that's a pretty important thing to recognize, is the variation of things that can be expected for a teaching assistant. Now, I said that there was also a resident assistant and a graduate assistant. At Purdue, a resident assistant would be someone who lives in the residence halls, and usually has responsibility for one or more floors, and they basically monitor what happens in campus housing or in the resident life. They're usually not just, they're not just there to watch over the floor, but they also are kind of expected to plan activities and to do a variety of things. Now, I've never served in this capacity, so I really can't speak in depth to the wide range of things that I expect that they probably do, but that's kind of what a resident assistant, at least at Purdue, does. And then you have a graduate assistant, and a graduate assistant is kind of a general moniker, but at Purdue, it typically, and sometimes at Purdue, instead of resident assistant for RA, it might be research assistant. And so there are various titles for this but it's basically a research assistant or a graduate assistant at Purdue typically is being paid to do research, to work on, and a lot of times it's on grants, like an NSF grant, an NIH grant, a DoD, DOE, you name your sponsor flavor or your contract flavor or even cooperative agreement flavor. And that's kind of what's expected. And the tasks there vary quite widely. And so a lot of times, at least at Purdue, a lot of those relationships are developed between faculty and student. Like for example, at Purdue, when you're a teaching assistant, oftentimes that's an arrangement where the department head is the one who assigns teaching assistants. Now, a faculty who's teaching a particular course that has teaching assistants in it, they can have some influence on that, but it's usually the department head who makes hiring decisions and firing decisions, and they do the performance review and all that. Relative to graduate assistantships or research assistants, it's usually the faculty who's making the hiring and firing decisions. And so that's typically how that works. RAs, it's usually for each residence hall, at least at Purdue Residence Hall, there's a senior individual, a top person who oversees that particular unit and that particular housing element and makes the decision. So that's kind of assistantship versus fellowship, right, out of the gate. One of the things I do want to note is that it's very common, is that, and honestly, funding from assistantships particularly, are not as stable as money's coming through fellowships. Money, a lot of times with assistantships, it's semester to semester. You get basically an offer letter, a continuation letter, if you will, from semester to semester. So it's at least at Purdue, it's uncommon to get much more. I think the longest letter that I have ever have seen, and particularly recently, most of it is from semester to semester. So don't be surprised. And this is one of the things that makes graduate student life kind of harrowing or kind of stressful. For sure, it's one of many. That can make things really stressful is having to, am I going to continue? Is my funding going to continue into next semester? And so that can certainly be a stressor. But so that's assistantship. So my first point is just assistantship versus fellowship. Second, let me talk about the financial aspect. So why are assistantships so important? Well, I mean, essentially, assistantships give you the ability to fund your graduate education. And I will admit, so you typically get a stipend, and you typically get a remission of your tuition. Usually you also have some healthcare or some other benefits that might come with it. Depending on the university, different universities pay at different levels. And so one of the things as a graduate student you always want to look at is, what does your offer include? You want to make sure that you consider, you have to consider the remission. And when I say remission, it's basically you don't owe the tuition. And so you have to count that or think of that in terms of, in reality, it is money that you're making. And so that carries over with it to a tax implication too, right? When you're talking about assistantships, you have to really get versed on the tax implications. Now, this is also another difference between assistantships and fellowships. Usually assistantships, because you're an employee, the institution automatically holds out your Social Security tax, your what's called FICA, your federal taxes, all of that stuff they hold out for you. On a fellowship, some institutions do and some institutions don't. So the key is to recognize, okay, if I'm on a fellowship at an institution, I need to know whether they're holding out taxes on me or not, because I'm going to have a tax liability at the end of the year. Now, if you're an international student and you're coming over to the United States to study, this is a huge deal, because a lot of times tax rules across countries and stuff, and particularly if you're not familiar with U.S. tax laws, it can be a pain in the butt. Now, I've done my taxes for many years, but I've had the benefit of living here and doing that over a matter of years. So I would highly recommend engaging an accountant. I know it's difficult at times because of the cost of that, but at least the first couple of years you may want to engage an accountant to make sure that you stay out of tax trouble. So financial aspects. So you have a stipend. I'm not going to throw out a number. Purdue stipends are not as good as some of the other Big Ten institutions. And this is one of the big things you're going to have to look at. You really want to look at cost of living, where you're going to be living when you stack that on top of what you're going to be making, just to make sure that it's livable. And graduate student salaries they're not intended to be, something that you're going to stay on for very long. And it's hard to live on a graduate salary, particularly if you have a married couple or, a couple who are both going to graduate school at the same time. It can be incredibly difficult financially, and it can be incredibly stressful, because you not only have the worry about, am I going to be funded that next semester, right? Or is my next semester going to be funded and on all that? But then you also have just you're living on a very little amount of money, and it can be done. I will be honest and say, when I got married my senior year of my undergraduate, which would have been 92, And I ended up becoming a super senior and stayed an extra semester as in my undergraduate, and then went on to my master's degree. My wife was working as a registered nurse full time while I was going to graduate school, and so that made it a little bit easier. And things were tight for us even then. I mean, she was a beginning RN, working hourly, working full time, 12, 312s. Uh, but nevertheless, it can be very difficult if two people are pursuing graduate studies at the same time. So just kind of, count the costs as you go into it, and just know I recognize that it's stressful and it's difficult, but that's a financial. So the stipend remission, again, you want to count that as part of, you want to actually factor that into your thinking of, it's money you don't owe. So I mean, it's not money that you're making, but it's certainly money that you don't owe. And it can, particularly if you're an international student or an out-of-state student, this can be significant amounts of money. Now, one of the things that I wrote down here is I want to make sure, if you're on an assistantship, one of the things you definitely want to consider is what fees come along with whatever program you're in. I'll say here at Purdue, each of our colleges have different fees that are attached. I mean, there's a graduate student activity fee. There are different fees, but each college can have its own, what we call it, a differential fee. That is a fee over and above what everybody else might pay. And there are certain colleges that, might be as much as $1,000 or $2,000 more than, a student in another program. And those monies are supposed to go to helping fund that program. Some programs just have more consumables or require more technology or equipment or whatever, and those differential fees go to help pay that. So make sure you, in your investigating programs, make sure you kind of ask questions about what fees are included in your graduate student bill, and which ones are you going to pay, which ones are remitted, so that you kind of know going into it what the costs are going to be. Healthcare and benefits, usually they're not the greatest, but they you can make do with it. Some programs, I even wrote down here, some programs even some universities even provide daycare, and there are other benefits that they may. So when you're looking at graduate student packages, make sure you look at the wide range. And then the last point that I wanted to make is knowing where your assistantship is. And what I mean by that is, who's your boss? This is where graduate school can be really tricky, is because oftentimes your assistantship, regardless of what kind it is, your assistantship, particularly if it's a research assistantship or a teaching assistantship, if it is with your major professor, your chair or advisor, the main person who guides and directs your research and your plan of study and all that, they're the ones that the major professor chairs your exams and all that. One of the difficulties, if that person is both your boss over your research and your academics, and your assistantship, if you have a good mentor, if things go well, no problem. But if you end up getting out of sorts with your major professor, it's very difficult to switch. I mean, because if you move from one major professor to another major professor, particularly under circumstances not great. I mean, moving the academic piece of it to pick a new chair is easier, but the financial piece can be difficult. And it also, so the one part is, as long as you've got a good mentor, everything's going to go well. But usually when it goes bad, it goes really bad. And I'm just being honest with you. And so this is one of the things you have to go in eyes wide open, knowing that it's really difficult because you have one person basically guiding, directing, or controlling, if you will, 3 areas of your life: academics, research, and your job, basically. The other thing that can make that difficult is those 3 things can oftentimes mix. And it can sometimes feel like you're working 60, 80 hours for your assistantship. And usually assistantships are like half-time, so 0.5 CUL or FTE, depending on what acronym you use to describe it. But the assumption is that that's supposed to be 20 hours of work. Well, when if you're taking research credits and you're working on your research and you have an assistantship, essentially those things can get murky, and it can kind of feel like you kind of have to keep things straight, that those things blur together, and it's really hard to separate out the idea that you're working half-time as a teaching assistant or as a research assistant, but you've got these other things going on too, and they can be blurred together. And sometimes graduate students, and I know even myself as a graduate student, sometimes I felt like I was working more than I was getting paid, and that might be true. But as I look back on it and I kind of separate the research work from the academic work from my employment, all right, so if you can separate those things, but a lot of times they're all under the same person, and so it all blurs together, and so it can be really hard. This is one of the things that creates stress, is just the heavy workload. And this is something that's epidemic right now, in my opinion. Not to be over dramatic, but it's an epidemic in the research community, graduate research community, and higher ed right now. Is just basically the mental stress, the anxiety, the depression, and all the things that graduate students deal with. So those are my 3 points: kind of understanding the difference between assistantship fellowship, understanding some of the financial aspects, and then also kind of, the blurry lines between assistantship and your research and your academic work. So like I said, over the coming weeks, till I run out of topics, I suppose I'm going to be kind of talking along this teaching assistant series. But I want to start out by kind of like, at least from my perspective and where I come from, what are the differences between teaching assistant and what are some of the parameters. So hope you're finding this useful. I hope you're looking forward to the startup of the fall semester. I think everybody's kind of excited, whether you're in academia or not, excited about fall kind of returning to some sense of normality, with us being able to connect with one another, go to events, and kind of get back to life as somewhat normal. So hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.